The funeral procession stretched for 3 kilometers. Commander Kale Vera had never seen anything like it, and he had lived through 4 interstellar wars, watched suns collapse, stood on the bridges of dying warships. But nothing in his 200 years of life had prepared him for this. Thousands of Vrethkai warriors lined the stone roads of the Citadel of Mourning. 7 foot tall, obsidian-skinned, with bioluminescent patterns running across their bodies like living constellations, they stood motionless. Silent. Every single one of them in the traditional posture of grief for the fallen leader, fists pressed to their chest plates, second set of arms folded behind the back, horns lowered toward the ground. They were doing this for a human. A small, soft, fragile, single-hearted human. Kale walked at the head of the procession, his golden ceremonial armor catching the light of the binary suns. Behind him, 4 of his most decorated warriors, each bearing 3 crest marks of battle, carried the coffin on their shoulders. The coffin itself was carved from Ithranwood, the most sacred timber on Vreth Prime, normally reserved only for high commanders and bloodline elders. A young scout from the 3rd Perimeter, barely old enough to have his bioluminescence fully develop, stepped close to one of the older warriors lining the path. His voice was barely a whisper. "Krev, who is in the coffin?" The old warrior did not look at him. His gaze stayed fixed forward, jaw locked tight. "The human," he said. "But, which human?" The old warrior's light patterns flickered, the Vrethkai equivalent of someone's voice breaking. "The human who protected our cubs." It had begun 18 months ago. The Vrethkai Citadel of Nurturing on Outpost 7 was not a military installation. It was a sanctuary, a place where the children of warriors killed in battle were raised collectively by the clan. 300 cubs, ranging in age from 2 cycles to 12 cycles. Too young to fight. Too precious to risk. Mara Ellison had arrived there as part of a diplomatic exchange program, one human medic assigned to study Vrethkai pediatric biology. She was 29 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in her boots. She had freckles across her nose, a medical scanner she'd named Gerald, and a habit of humming old Earth folk songs while she worked. The Vrethkai children found her fascinating in the way that prey finds a harmless creature fascinating, with confused curiosity. She was so small. Her skin didn't glow. She had no horns, no secondary arms, no reinforced skeletal plating. She had to sleep 8 hours a night like she was broken. And yet, within 2 weeks, Mara Ellison had learned 30 words of Vrethkai. Within a month, she could identify all 300 cubs by name. She taught them card tricks with a worn deck she kept in her jacket. She sat with the ones who had nightmares. She learned which ones were allergic to the standard nutrient compounds and quietly reformulated their meals. She became, in the way that humans somehow always managed to do, necessary. Commander Kale had visited Outpost 7 during a supply rotation and had stood in the doorway of the common hall, watching this tiny human sit cross-legged on the floor, completely surrounded by Vrethkai cubs twice her size, doing something called reading aloud. She was telling them a story about a man who built a ship to survive a flood. He had stood there for 11 minutes without her noticing him. "She is strange," his second-in-command, Sub-Commander Veth, had observed. Yes, Kale had agreed. But the cubs listened to her. The cubs listened to her like she is a clan elder. Kale had said nothing. But he had filed it somewhere deep, in the part of his mind where he stored things that mattered. The reckory came at the 3rd hour of the night cycle. They had been hunting Vrethkai outposts for 6 months, a splinter faction, violent and ideologically broken, specializing in striking soft targets. The Citadel of Nurturing was exactly the kind of target they preferred. No battle-ready warriors. No heavy armaments. Only caretakers. And 1 human medic. The perimeter sensors failed first. Then the communications array. Mara Ellison woke up to the sound of the emergency alert 3 seconds before the outer wall breached, because she had made it a habit, after 2 weeks of reading military logs out of sheer boredom. To sleep with her personal alert system set 2 thresholds lower than standard. She had 47 seconds before the Reverie reached the Cubs' dormitory. What Mara Ellison did in those 47 seconds would later be reconstructed by Vrethkai military analysts and entered into their Warrior Codex under the heading, Actions Exceeding Biological Expectation. She sealed the dormitory from the inside. She activated every medical containment barrier she had designed for quarantine, not combat, but sufficient to buy time. She pulled the 3 eldest cubs, the 12-cycle ones, to her and spoke to them in rapid, clear Vrethkai. You are going to do exactly what I say. Not because I am asking. Because those younger ones are looking at you and they will be as calm as you are. Understood? The eldest cub, a male named Sorath who had watched his father die in the Kelvrin campaign, looked at this tiny, glowing skinless, hornless, fragile human woman, and said, Understood. She directed the eldest cubs to form a perimeter around the younger ones. She used her medical scanner, Gerald, to access the facility's environmental systems and flooded 2 of the outer corridors with anesthetic gas she synthesized from the medical bay's pediatric sedation compounds, which slowed the first Reverie advance for 6 critical minutes. She barricaded the door with everything that wasn't bolted down and some things that were. She kept the cubs calm by continuing to tell them the story about the flood and the boat. Her voice did not shake. The analysts would note this specifically. Her biometric data, recovered from her medical monitor, showed a heart rate of 142 beats per minute. Elevated cortisol. Hands with a micro-tremor she actively suppressed. Her voice did not shake. Commander Kale's Rapid Response Unit breached Outpost 7's outer hull 19 minutes after the alarm. They found the Reverie disoriented, 4 of them unconscious in the gassed corridors, the rest hammering against a reinforced door that had been barricaded with medical equipment, storage units, and what appeared to be a structural support beam that a human female had somehow moved. Inside, 300 cubs. Unharmed. The youngest ones were asleep. They had found this preferable to being frightened, apparently. Mara Ellison was sitting in the middle of them, still talking. She stopped when the door opened. She looked at Kale. She said, Gerald took some damage. Can someone check if the calibration is salvageable? Then she passed out. She had internal bleeding from moving that support beam. 2 cracked ribs from a Reverie impact that had gotten through the door before she'd fully sealed it. The medical team worked on her for 4 hours. Kale sat outside the medical bay for all 4 of them. She had survived. She had recovered. She had spent the following year working across 3 more Vrethkai outposts, teaching cubs, reformulating nutrient compounds, naming her replacement scanner Gerald too. The heart attack had come without warning. A genetic anomaly, human hearts, the Vrethkai doctors noted with something approaching outrage, were unconscionably fragile. She was 31 years old. The Coffin passed through the gates of the Citadel. 300 cubs, now in the Warrior Youth Program, now wearing training armor, now growing into what they would become, stood in formation along the inner wall. Sorath, the eldest, 15 cycles now and already showing the bioluminescent markings of early warrior development, stepped forward as the procession passed. He raised his fists to his chest. Lowered his horns. The rest followed. Kale stopped. He looked at the young Vrethkai warriors standing in grief honor for a human woman who had read them a story about a flood while her hands trembled and her voice did not. Something moved in his chest, in all 4 chambers of his reinforced warrior heart. He turned to face the assembled crowd, to the thousands who had come from across the sector, who had heard the story and traveled to pay their respects. His voice, amplified by his armor's resonance system, carried across the entire citadel. She had no claws. No plating. No bioluminescence. No second arms. She could not lift the beam, and she lifted the beam. She could not slow the Reverie, and she slowed them for 6 minutes. She could not stop fear, and she told a story, and not one cub was afraid. He paused. The humans have a saying, courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite it. He looked at the coffin. She was afraid. I have read her biometrics. Her heart was beating at 142 times per minute. Her hands shook. The silence across the citadel was absolute. Her voice did not. He placed his fists against his chest. Lowered his horns. Mara Ellison, he said. Protector of cubs. Clan friend of Vreth. You carried none of our armor, and yet you were the strongest one in that room. Behind him, thousands of Vrethkai warriors lowered their horns in unison. The binary suns moved across the sky. And in the great citadel of morning, for the first time in recorded Vrethkai history, the funeral bells rang for someone who had never once been a warrior, and somehow, impossibly, had been the bravest soul any of them had ever known. Somewhere, in a universe full of apex predators and ancient civilizations and species that could crack moons with their warships, a small, freckled human woman had sat cross-legged on a floor surrounded by frightened children. And kept her voice steady. That was enough. That was everything.